do a quick acknowledgement of country before we start the seminar. So the
Okay.
University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and their custodianships of the land which we meet here, which is the Turrbal and Yagara people here in Brisbane. And do you know the custodians of your land, Rob?
Um, the Native Americans of Connecticut are the Pequot and the Mohegans
And we pay
who
our
originally owned this land. Yes.
thank you. We pay our respects to the ancestors and descendants who continue cultural, spiritual connections to country here and also over there in yours, Rob, and we recognize their valuable contribution to Australian and global society. There you go. We may now begin. Again, the floor is yours. There you go.
All right. Well, I'll thank you all again for attending. Special thanks, of course, to Carlina, my good, not so old friend, sort of old friend, to Kate, um, and to Tin alias Christina, and also Samantha, whom I've never met. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about this because I don't really think about much else when I'm looking at conservation. Um, I left Rio Cal team after a period of about 18 years in uh, the end of 2023. I am not speaking on behalf of Rio Cal team, but about them. I assisted in developing this program of conservation there. And I think, oops, we're going to have oh, this is interesting. See if I can get the slide to move. No, I'm just getting my, now, can you see no, you can't see the PowerPoint anymore. As usual. Okay. Now, as I struggle with this program actually didn't start at Kalimantan, but began in Sarawak, where I was asked to develop a conservation department in a 500,000 hectare acacia plantation near Bintulu. We did it for about 3.5 years and had a an international conference about it. And the text of that entire conference I've already sent over to Kate. So if you're interested, it looks like that funny little book there. And of course, this incredible article in Nature that came up around, as a result of that, logging the new conservation, which I was a little surprised at that, but I guess, yeah, it helps to attract readers. Kalimantan, of course, is part of the island of Borneo. Malaysia has about 25%, whereas Indonesia, the four provinces, yeah, and Kalimantan are 75, just about 75%. Much flatter, vast areas of wetland, and actually for plantation crops, I mean, following logging, it was a very uh, lucrative thing to plant. Of course, in the early days, as far as we know, almost 90% of Kalimantan was covered in forests. Now, the anthropologists will tell you that those were not so-called virgin forests. A lot of them had been lived in for centuries, maybe thousands of years by the local people, but without any significant damage. As you can see by the map, a lot of the forests are gone uh, and have been converted into all kinds of things, plantations, acacia, oil palm, sometimes just imparator grass. So this is what we used to see when I first went to Malaysia and Indonesia. You had to step out of the way because there were so many of them. This was a quick source of cash for developing countries. And so the trees were uh, harvested with great speed and enthusiasm. But of course, once the trees were no longer economical, not big enough for the wrong species, the um, the countries began to look for alternative sources of revenue from the land. Now, as this began, because plantations began to develop so fast, the countries were reminded by FAO and others that, excuse me, they should have conservation reserves. Now, the old idea was the sort of feudal one, which, was practiced in the West of the lord or the king having his or whatever hunting reserves, etc. But by the time the 20th century rolled around, um, totally protected areas were all the rage. Supposedly up to 10% of the landscape. Um, Not always chosen because of who was in them, but because they were beautiful or there were species of that were noteworthy. Um, and this proceeded until about maybe 1980s, when the land available that you could just draw circles on a map became much more difficult to find. Now, some of the local people actually were practicing conservation in a way because they would use shifting cultivation of cycles of up to 30 years in some cases and leave, especially, for example, the Iban and Sarawak, so-called pulau or bits of how many 50, 100 hectares of original forest that were mainly for the people to use to build their boats and their houses and other products, non-timber products. Um, but as a result of the plantation development, mainly first logging and then plantations, that amount of land available began to be very difficult to find. It was already on maps of the government for various things from logging to agriculture. So I got involved in this more or less in what you call business angle of conservation by working for Smartwood in Indonesia, which is a timber certification outfit. And the idea was to combine the conservation elements that the conservationists were very concerned about with the business model that was, of course, for profit. Now, working with businesses, this work that I've done is not academic. I used to teach in the university for about 20 years, but working with businesses is very different. Um, Probably the most stark difference is if you're working in a company, um, if you bring up difficulties or problems, most of the time they would prefer not to hear about it. They would much prefer you to say, everything is going well and we're going to get more profits next year. Of course, in the university, you put up a paper and everybody tries to find ways that you didn't do something right, which is pretty much why science is always better. Um, After the logging had proceeded for several decades, these El Nino droughts, or so-called INSO, that happened when I was in Sabah and also in Sarawak um, in the years there, 82, 83, 97, 98, and again in, I think, 2005, tended to burn log forests very quickly. Original forests, almost never, but these log forests, particularly that had been logged several times, essentially incinerated most of the trees and all the understory. And of course, these areas became a favorite to develop plantations. Um, and of course, In order to develop plantations, you had to clear the land. Now, most of these lands that had been earmarked for agriculture were agriculture, that required several cycles of logging. And then finally, before the bulldozers came in, the local people were given access to whatever trees were left. But once that was done, the bulldozers came in and took care of the rest of the standing vegetation, turning it into beautiful geometric designs of oil palm. And oil palm, I'm sure you know, is probably one of the most valuable agricultural products that has ever been developed because as a vegetable oil, it has many uses, both as food and industrial uses, etc. As you can see, it's really productive. And unlike soy or some of the others, it produces the year round. You can plant it together in tight groups for thousands of hectares, and it does its job of producing the fruits that everybody wants. On a map, it looks something like this. This is the estates um, in and around Riakaltim, and you can see right away on false color that the oil palm comes up as red. Um, but one important feature of this is, as you can probably see, the conservation areas do stand out as green. And these are connected outside to the forests surrounding the estates. So that is probably one of the most valuable aspects of this thing is this crop, is that it is connected to the landscape, and it is not, in most cases, completely eradicating the local vegetation. Of course, a lot of this is original vegetation, and that is where that's the most important stuff for conservation. So the company gave us an office. I was delighted because it was designed by a German architect who was very helpful. And of course, as you must know, America still uses imperial measurement. So when I gave him the design, I think he assumed it was in meters. And so the office tended to be much bigger than originally planned, which was wonderful. 3 sections of this program were based loosely on the FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council certification principles and criteria. One, essentially the physical part and the human part, which is the crop under the plantation ecology, names that I kind of made up, so get used to that. Biodiversity, which of course, the reason that I actually went there in the early days was I was asked to come in and please get rid of the orangutans. And I thought that was really not a very good idea, and replied that I thought if they kept the orangutans, they could probably benefit from that, both the orangutans and the company. So we set up biodiversity uh, assessments and aspects of management, and also not to be actually third, one of the most important was the community program. And that is not easy when a company comes in and converts the landscape that the local people are used to into something that is pretty hard to live with. Of course, this is all politics, and I'm not going there. Excuse me, but it is one important feature of the conservation that probably needs more emphasis. Now, we had principles with this conservation program. One, to conserve or enhance the original values of the landscape. In other words, we only assume we're going to work with what was there when we arrived, not some uh, original vegetation that occurred there 30 years before. Also, to minimize any negative impacts, both of the company or, in some cases, the local folks who like to farm by burning off areas. As I get over my flu here, I will have a sip of water, please. Right. And then provide long-term benefits for all. Obviously, for the species, for the communities, and for the company. And this little mantra from um, uh, uh, metapopulation ecology, look for stability and permanence, and eventually persistence, meaning species are still there. The plantation folks, we had a gang of about five teams that monitor the water quality, especially whether the water coming out of the conservation areas actually improved, even though we're surrounded by the estates, whether the forest is being kept in good nick based on boundaries and surveys to improve to avoid any kind of illegal wood harvesting. Excuse me. Now, this is what a design of the estate was for when we got there. It was the only one we had the opportunity to design, and that is to make large corridors of conservation along larger rivers, slightly narrower ones along streams. Certain, like this one in the middle is a bat cave that the managers themselves asked to be kept out of the planting. And ideally, this pattern is permanent, and this provides a corridor and also a place for a lot of the wildlife. The each estate was marked very clearly as a conservation area because if that was not done, many people who wander around in the area may think that it was good for, excuse me, hunting or agriculture. And it was an ongoing process to work with them to make sure that this was forest that provided resources that they were used to using before the company arrived. My flu is back. Um, One example of how the plantation ecology part was emphasizing natural things is natural pest control. The oil palm is a great target for squirrels, for rats, other pests or so-called pests. However, we have jungle cats that like to eat the rats. We have bay owls that eat the rats, and we have my favorite, the short python. So this provides a stopgap and a way of avoiding the use of things like claret. Excuse me. That, of course, is apparently the reason that some elephants died in Sabah from eating that rat poison. As far as the species, the idea that we came up with is we would try to identify every single species of vertebrate that we had and collect this information on all of them, scientific name and so on, status, so that we could then know what we had and then along over time find out what's happening to it. Would we have lost it any or added any or then be able to prioritize action, of course, giving the most attention to the critically endangered species. Now, I'm very fond of a sort of a short explanation of how you manage species by Graham Coughley, a famous Australian biologist. There are things that you don't want, you think are detrimental, you hope that they decrease. For other things like this ironwood, which is one of the most important timber trees in the landscape for the communities, you would hope that it will try to make it increase. Um, Things that are edible or usable, use them sustainably. Monitor them so that you always have them around. And finally, there are species that you see all the time, but you're not really concerned with them, except that you want to know whether they're still there. Now, if one of those disappears, it might have serious uh, meaning to the conservation program. Something is happening that you're not aware of. The critically endangered species that we had from the time I went there and until now are orangutans. We had just under 30 that we knew about. Excuse me, we kept track of them. The Asian pangolin, which amazingly was relatively common. They were not hunting it there, which was a great relief. And then the Siamese crocodile. Well, we can talk about that in a bit. The star of the show, though, was the orangutans. And so we felt that it was our business not only to find out where they were, when they were there, who it was, whether it was a female or a male, as you can see here, or a baby, sort of estimate how old they were, where they were feeding, what they were feeding on, including oil palm, and then the relation between the workers and the orangutans, especially if is any conflict, which fortunately, generally there was not. And finally, local students who could do studies for their scriptsy or their fourth year projects. If I do this again, I won't bring my flu along. So just for 1 year, we had about 392 species entered with all the data that I mentioned, GPS point, date, location, habitat, um, and how many times it had been seen. Um, and in 2022, 3 of the species were critically endangered, endangered 9, and a lot of other species that were just, and sometimes quite a surprise to see. And these guys who are always looking in the cameras all the time and seem to like it. I guess they haven't asked for their photos yet. Apart from that, we use the information on the species to put out posters and leaflets, either in English or in Indonesian language. It turned out I think, probably about 15 different leaflets or pamphlets that we circulated to the schools and around to the surrounding villages. This handsome young guy on the left is one who used to hang around the field station and didn't look terribly happy, but he seemed to be healthy at least. Now here is one is probably the least emphasized, possibly the most important. We kept seedlings, tree seedlings of uh, local forest fruits, things consumed by the wildlife as well as the local people. We would distribute them regularly to villages, or when we had the students come for conservation camps, they would also get one each. And expect there were thousands of trees planted starting in 2008. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly how many, but This, of course, is one of the best ways to keep carbon around. And we, I hope that this is still going. I assume that it is. About every month or so, we would have a conservation edu camp. The staff would go down and we would have classes from the local schools, usually the elementary schools. Talk to them about the forest. We had a forest reserve, a small one near the field station, so that they could go out and get an idea of. Some of them already knew the names of the plants, but just a more organized approach to give a little bit more exposure to what we were doing in conservation. And of course, finding out local knowledge from the villages on what they wanted and what they needed out of the forest. And there are still quite a few things that they, apart from medicinal plants, many of the customary items that they made, they needed to have the forest, not not oil palm. Excuse me. This the one of the most important animals to the non-Muslims, the Dayaks, who are quite abundant around those areas, this is the bearded pig. And we monitored them for over a decade. And you may have heard about the African swine flu and how the problems that that was causing. Strangely, we didn't see that either in Kalimantan or Sarawak. That is, we didn't see declines in the pigs, but they did apparently decline in other areas. And there was an article partially on that published by our staff. Oh boy. Yes. Now, this may be one of the most important things that happened with Rhea. In 2008, as a conservation guy, we were told that a new property had been purchased, actually two, and we were supposed to go and have a look at it. Turns out that this particular property, called Masangat, uh, or Ciptadawia Mandiri was the name of the estate, was mostly wetland. And not only was it wetland, but when we went in and started looking around, it had several, maybe as many as five endangered species, including, drum roll, the Siamese crocodile. And you may think that seems a little peculiar that that would be there since it's supposed to be in Thailand or Indochina. But it turns out that, yes, indeed, it is actually a breeding population of Siamese crocodile. Also, for the long-snouted Sunda gharial was abundant here. And there was altogether about between 8 to 10,000 hectares of swampy land that if it had been attempted to plant oil palm there, but it was a failure because, of course, the floods could be as high as 4 meters once or twice a year. And unless you want to harvest the oil palm with scuba gear, that's really not probably the best idea. As a result, a foundation was set up to try to manage this separately for conservation, called the Yayasan Ulin, or the Ironwood Foundation. And as you can see, we have a luxurious field station there on the water for those of you that would really enjoy that kind of lifestyle of living at close quarters with people at about, I don't know, 5 square meters. But we did a lot of surveys there and had, first of all, to deal with conflicts. This was a Sunda gharial that, as soon as the area was open, attacked somebody's cow, and the poor cow was wounded, and the Sunda gharial was trussed up, and we tried to provide compensation, but The compensation was something like, I think it was requested to have 700 US dollars or something, um, which at that point we couldn't afford. Um, the sad part is this poor old girl uh, died, as well as the cow, who also died. So what we ended up doing was compensating for the cow and tried to convince people not to catch these sundigeros anymore. Now, we had international students working with our staff to uh, take the details of the biology of these two crocodilians, and they are published in Raffles Bulletin if you want to look at them. Um, and there's a new Yayasan Ulin, no longer connected to the company, that is, of course, one of the principles of that uh, effort is Carlina, who can tell you all about it, I'm sure. But it's a very good thing that the foundation is still active there and the company no longer is trying to develop the place. So among the endangered species is this guy, the proboscis monkey, that we are hoping will increase because the area now is regenerating naturally. It's going to take a while, but at least these populations will survive. Uh, at one point, we noticed there was a strange-looking stork, and it turned out that is also endangered, the storm stork, and that is in a publication, BirdLife International, if you like to look at that. And we also do things with the local universities, and these are good friends in UNAS, the Universitas Nacional, interested primarily in orangutans, but I had students that went and did other things, and there are the occasional strange species that show up, like Godwin and this guy, and they were some of the best friends we had. The lecturers there at the university. So the question is, I guess, why are we doing this? And the answer, as far as I can say, is any forest that we can save for any reason is worth it. And any original vegetation, where this jargon is tossed around of high conservation value and all that, that's great. I agree. But for me, any original vegetation that can be preserved in Kalimantan is high conservation value. And so the days of large protected areas are essentially over. Some of those are even shrinking a bit. So if we can provide additional space for species and as additional protection or perhaps sustainable use, um, the hope is that they will be around and persist for the future. That's thank you, by the way. And this is the two logos of Rhea Conservation and Yayasan Ulin. And I'd like to repeat that I am very grateful to Rio Cal team for taking this on and being brave enough to pursue conservation that is not just part of the industry's so-called corporate social responsibility. They actually did the science, and they're still doing it. Certification has come. Certification is a good thing, but unlike science, it's not self-correcting. It's sort of once you get the certification, you may have somebody come in for a few weeks once a year to tell you how you're doing, but we actually need people on the ground all the time. That's the only thing that works. Thanks also to Sarawak and the humbly called Grand Perfect Conservation Department, on all the scientists and NGOs and friends who helped us, including somebody who's ran away to Australia, Chris Helgen, who's an old friend and was with us in Sarawak. So thank you very much for your, attending this, and I hope that if there are any questions or comments that I'll can hear them now. Thanks.
Frog for that really interesting talk. Is that steroids or is that Ansonia frog?
It is, it is, it looks like an Ansonia.
The,
Yeah, yeah. But
it's blended,
actually, I have never seen this one. That's my excuse, right?
very nicely blended in there. Um,
Yeah.
I'm going to open the floor to questions, but maybe before that, I'm going to be a bit cheeky and have a question of my own and saying like, so are you saying companies are usually considered the enemy in conservation? Are you saying that we should attempt more to collaborate with them?
You know, that's a question that would take me like days to answer. But there are some, you know, na sort of nation-based or national conservation organizations are great to operate at the highest levels. The drawback is that, in my experience, if you go to the president of an oil palm company and they say, "Yeah, you really ought to do some conservation or whatever it is, a certification," and the answer will be, "Oh, yeah, great, yeah, well, that's good, we'll do that." And then you get to the company on the ground where the managers are paid a bonus for every hectare of oil palm that they plant and harvest. A little bit of a conflict there. And I think the great thing is that the companies can provide a stable environment for a good scientific program that doesn't really cost them much. I think most people don't realize how expensive certification actually is, and you're only getting consultants' feedback for a couple of weeks a year, something like that. Whereas with a team of conservation, whether it's, 10 or 12 or that integrates with the local community, and then you get students to come in and do studies, providing essentially free information. They just need a place to sleep and some food. So, I mean, my answer is the companies can do it. Many of them are just falling back on certification because it's easier.
Very interesting insight. All right, is there any questions from the room?
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you. That was super interesting. Two things. Do you think is this sort of model pretty unique in terms of the plantations in Borneo, or is there any movement for other companies to kind of be doing something like that, or are you aware of the only one kind of in the main area doing something like
How's this for an answer? Yes and no.
that?
Um, for a long time, I thought that this really was it. The one in Sarawak, again, humbly called Grand Perfect, kind of let it drop after I left. But one of the staff that worked for me has set it up again in a separate company nearby and is doing the same this program. So that's really heartening. And I think in Kalimantan, there's one in central Kalimantan that is assisted by Copenhagen Zoo, and they're doing quite well. So, but it's always uphill. It's, two steps forward, one step back. I hope not, one step forward, two steps back. But it's going to take a while for anything to catch on, and it will have to have some benefit to the companies, and that's where we are going to be challenged.
But that's my background. I've come from working with orangutans in this world, and something like this would be is amazing opportunities for when you're looking for money, when organisations in the US and Australia are looking to support on the ground conservation. That's interesting.
Well, I appreciate, the question. There is abundant information about this, both from Sarawak and from Kalimantan, because we've been propagandizing about this. So there's plenty of material available. Maybe it's also good to get in touch with Brian Martin, who is on the ground in Kalimantan, taking over the pure conservation aspect.
Is it okay to share your email, Rob, if anyone wants to get in touch?
Yes. Email or WhatsApp. The worst thing that can happen is I could hang up, because I'm asleep. But because you're not exactly on my clock here, I mean, on my time. But yes, my email and the WhatsApp number, and any questions or comments, I'd be delighted to field.
I'll share that after.
Thanks. This was just an amazing talk, and it was particularly interesting how often you touched on times when sort of the conservation happened to overlap with what the company was doing anyway. You mentioned the bat caves where they kind of came to you and said they wanted to set it aside, or they had this sort of marshy area that they couldn't really do much with anyway. So as we look towards maybe moving more in this direction in the future and trying to partner more, do you have any sort of insight into trying to identify those places where interests sort of already align?
Oh, that's a tricky one, because most of the guys that go into this, are laborers, right? Laborers just do what they're told and are exploited quite, a lot. It took several years for us to, well, the first thing we had to do was to make sure that the guys working in the oil palm didn't think we're a bunch of flaky, guys who wandering around with all due, apologies, binoculars and just pointing at birds and saying, "Oh, how beautiful." No, we had to get up, work with them, be up at 7, go home after 5, make sure that our schedules matched theirs. And then after a few years, we started getting some of them who really liked the conservation work. And as I said, the feedback was, the crocodiles, the bats, and there was a lot of positive feedback from people that sort of been, I hate to say turned, but who began to appreciate that this was good for them too.
Thank you.
I didn't answer your question, I think, but other than that,
I think arguably you did, though, because it sounds like part of the answer there is if we're going to try to identify these overlaps, we kind of have to focus on building that relationship first so that the communication is actually there.
They're the people that can tell you where stuff is, including the villagers. Yeah. We're sort of lost without that information.
I've got. Yeah, thanks again for the talk. It's interesting seeing conservation approach through working with a corporation lens where I wouldn't call myself a conservationist, but I've been in a lot of departments and heard a lot of talks about it. And I'm coming from Canada, where at least traditionally the lens of conservation is like you box off a piece of land and you set it aside and you don't touch it. And so
Tradition.
You were touching a lot in your presentation about working with the local communities and sustainable harvest. And so I guess I'm just wondering, coming from outside and working in a place like Borneo where there's a lot of presence people for thousands of years who have been using the land. I'm just wondering if you found any clash or how you can reconcile the I guess more Western strict lens of conservation versus integrating what the people there are doing with the land and hoping they can continue to use it. Sorry, that was long-winded. I hope it makes sense.
Yeah, I didn't have time for us to write a book on that. There are lots of books, I think. The Well, first of all, um, I think conservation it's helpful if you're gonna do it someplace, you gotta be there. You can't kind of swan in and swan out and say, "Oh, look, you gotta be careful about this and don't do that." And okay, I'll see you next year. Um, One of the things we learned was there was a crocodile, this Sundagario, that was assumed to be, well, initially it was considered critically endangered, and then it was data deficient, and then we went there, and of course lived there for 15 years or more, and was told by one of the local guys who said, "Oh, that's the most common crocodile in all of Kalimantan," and it turned out it was. And so, if you stay around, if you live there, people were bringing them to the office and say, "What do we do with this? It damaged our fish net." Say, "Well, we'll pay you for the net, but we'll let the crocodile go over there." And so that's this first thing is, and the second thing is speak the local language. It matters. It's always nice to communicate people in whatever language but if you're going to do it in Kalimantan or in Sarawak or Sabah, English is great, but the local language is the one that you have to know. And I don't know how Kalina feels about this, but it's always been something that I felt to be paramount in getting some message across, that you can go there and show pictures and show all kinds of things and speak in English, and then you sometimes get into a situation that unfortunately, I find I may have been part of, is called colonial science, where, we know better, we're going to tell you what to do. And the rest of you, well, if you can't do it, well, we pity you because you're ignorant. That's this sort of thing. But that's politics, so I'm going to stay away from it, maybe.
Yeah, I think definitely going there without a mindset of thinking that we're better than them or gonna tell them what to do helps a lot with integrating with the community. I think that's more important than speaking the language, is the willingness to learn and be with them, and so they accept you as feeling like they're part of family, especially Indonesia being a very collective society. I mean, that's my 2 cents, I guess.
It's more than 2 cents, I think.
And also, if anyone's interested, you mentioned Brian. So Brian's actually worked a lot with Rob in many, many projects. And now Brian's the one on the ground leading the main conservation NGO there. He recently got a research station getting ready over there in East Kalimantan. And he's always tells me that he's welcome for anyone who wants to drop by just to learn or do research. There's orangutans near the research station. He knows there. And then the team knows how to get into the villages. You can stay in that raft that you showed, Rob. And then, take a mandi over there when there's crocodile infested water. It's right next to you.
Well, you went and did that, Carlina, so you know.
I went in the water too. Oh, great. But yeah, so anyone there's Rob over there, and anyone who's also keen to know more about the project, I'm happy to share the details. They're always happy to get people to learn more and lend a hand.
No question. I do have a little follow-up. So like that, thanks for your perspective. Like that was, really helpful to hear more about like the interactions with the local people there, especially like your perspective coming in as an outsider. When it comes to actually doing the conservation on the ground though, and like, achieving the goals that you want, in terms of conserving the native species and stuff, to what extent did you find having to like just exclude any activity within these areas versus allowing people to come in and use some of the, species and that kind of thing, like where it seems from the maps you showed to be such a heavily exploited piece of, the earth where there's so much plantation activity and stuff going on. Like in order to achieve meaningful conservation, do you have to just cordon off areas, or is there room also for more like, mixed between conservation and sustainable use?
That's an interesting question because I do think that you're verging on that original model of, to many people, conservation means protection or preservation. Well, that's true, but it also, strictly speaking, means wise use. And my feeling is, yeah, I mean, there's always room for setting aside, particularly this wetland of Masangat, because it you can't really use it for anything else, thank goodness. But there are all kinds of species out there. You can't assume sustainable use of an orangutan, you just so you have to protect them. But they're living in mixed use habitats near people and then around the plantation. So you can't just say, well, all this area has to be protected because it has orangutans. Well, they're living amongst us. So the point is really that we have to somehow integrate our activities with the wildlife. Some things are not endangered, really. This flat-headed cat, considered critically endangered, but we used to see them fairly regularly, and we can prove that they're not going away. So I'm not a fan of promoting conservation just as protection or preservation. I think local people use a lot of these things, and what we did where the endangered species were involved is there's a lot of hunting. They've been doing that for a while, a few thousand years. That certain things they were not to hunt, orangutans, and they usually don't want to hunt them. Uh, Things like sun bears, which in fact are quite common. Some people would kill me for saying that, and then uh, deer, sambar deer, which are in fact protected in Indonesia, but are always so-called fair game, and they are still, if we look at 15 years, they're still around. They're not going anywhere. And that's probably the beauty of a long-term view rather than going in, going out, and then thinking, oh, you sort of figured it out. Sorry for the long answer, but that's sort of my stand on that.
Yeah, that's great. No, thank you.
Any more questions? Anything you want to say, Rob, before I close talk?
Thanks.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
All right, we'll share your contacts around if anyone wants to get in touch. And thanks so much.
And for Tin for overcoming my incompetence with this Zoom.
We'll also share around the proceedings that you sent, if that's okay with you.
Yeah. I would, if you have time, look at the proceedings of that conference in Sarawak, which you have. And it's a whole bunch of scientists and people of all kinds, and what they said, because I feel strongly that this should be something seriously considered for conservation.
Thank you. All right, well, thanks so much for your time, and talk soon, and yeah, see you. Have a good night over there.
Yeah, I'll wait for breakfast. Yeah, and drop me a line, anybody who feels like it.